Hey, what's up, everyone? My name is Connor Harris. I'm re-recording this talk I gave for the Coaches in Quarantine conference. The internet connection was unfortunately pretty bad, so I didn't want to upload something where you guys could barely hear or see me. So I'm just going to redo this whole talk, hitting the same exact things, hopefully making it a lot more clear for you guys that couldn't necessarily hear or see me very well due to the unfortunately poor internet connection. So the idea behind this presentation is weight room training is gait training, whether you're aware of it or not. What does that mean? Well, let's dig in and let's find out. So first, just a little bit of background about me. Like I said, my name is Connor Harris. I am a certified strength and conditioning coach. I graduated with a Bachelor's of Science from Oregon State University, where I worked with the sports teams there. I was heavily involved in a lot of realms of fitness and sports performance early on in my career, and I was fortunate enough to get exposed to some really cool stuff really early on in my career, and it's led me down this path where today I have my own LLC, Pinnacle Performance. I have something called the Coaches Club, which I will talk about later, and also I have my own podcast called the Pinnacle Performance Podcast, where I just bring on some guests that I think have really cool and interesting things to say, and we just kind of talk shop for a little bit. So if you guys are interested in more of these kinds of concepts that I'm talking about, I would highly recommend you guys check out my podcast, the Coaches Club, and also my website, thepinnacleperformance.com. And if you want to find me on social media, those are my handles right there. So why bipedal gait? Why do we care about being upright on two limbs where so many animals are on four limbs? Well, because human beings have pretty much won the game of survival, there's evolutionary benefits to being able to be upright on two legs. So first of all, it frees our hands so that we can carry our offspring. We can carry food to and from certain locations. And it frees up our hands to be used as weapons, frankly. We can carry weapons. We can use our fists as weapons. And overall, it's just more efficient for being able to gather resources. So improved vision as well. If we're on all fours, it's hard to see quite as far over the horizon or a distance away for potential predators and prey, because we don't have that couple of extra feet. Once we gain that extra couple of feet by becoming more upright, everything in terms of peripheral vision, in terms of how far we can see away predators and prey, and potential things in the distance that might be beneficial for survival, all of a sudden that whole process becomes a little bit easier. Threat display theory. Imagine you just hit this big time shot in basketball, or you scored a touchdown, or you see MMA fighters who, when they win a fight, they puff out their chest, they bang their chest with their fists, and they might yell or say something provocative. And really what that is this threat display theory. If we can be more upright, if we can be taller, like think about a bear when it's trying to show dominance. A bear will go upright on two limbs because the bigger we can make ourselves, the more of a threat we are. That's why taller males tend to be more attractive on average than shorter males, because they might have better genes, because they're bigger, because they're probably going to make for a better mate in terms of genetic output for offspring. So temperature regulation as well. So if we're on all fours and we're in the desert, or we're in this environment where there's a lot of sun, ultimately what's going to happen is we're going to have a lot of our surface area of our skin be exposed to the sun. But if we're more upright and we have hair on our heads, then we have less relative surface area exposed to the sun, so we don't have to spend as many calories, as much energy regulating our body temperature to a healthy level for homeostasis. Improved movement economy. There's less oxygen consumed on average for upright bipedal creatures such as ourselves to travel a distance relative to an animal that would be on all four limbs. Because of the makeup of our hips, our femurs, our legs, and our limbs, it is more efficient for us to walk on two legs, because that decreases oxygen demand, and it's going to improve overall movement economy, so we can travel further distances, we can chase down our prey for longer, and overall our metabolic efficiency is heightened due to this adaptation. So from step one, literally in gait, When we first are toddlers, we are self-organizing ourselves into the most metabolically efficient gait that we can find. We're constantly trying to stand up. We fall on our butts. We get back up again. We're trying to say, should we step on our toes? Should we strike the ground with our heel on the outside, on the inside? This is all a process that we are designed to go through to find the most metabolically efficient gait, meaning spending the least amount of calories, least amount of energy for the most amount of results, because that's what survival is all about. And we're not too far removed, relatively speaking, in terms of just history from being hunters and gatherers, from not knowing where our next meal comes from. So it's very important for us to be able to find the strategy where we have to spend the least amount of energy for the most amount of results. So the idea is to translate our center of mass through a space in that path of least resistance. And we keep coming back to this idea because really it's all about survival. If we consciously alter our gait, let's say I'm a distance runner and I notice that my right knee caves in every single time I take a step. Now, someone could look at that through gait analysis and say, well, that's not really efficient, so I want you to keep your knee out when you run. If I were to consciously think about that, that would actually be significantly more expensive in terms of metabolic efficiency than if I were just to let my body's naturally self-organized strategy do its job, because it wasn't by mistake that my right knee is caving in. That was a very specific and intentional action by my brain, by my body, that resulted in me spending the least amount of calories for the most amount of results. So the body doesn't particularly care if that's going to wear and tear on you. It just wants to get the task done in the most efficient way possible. Now, there's so many individual factors that could influence this. You could have range of motion limitations, differences in lengths of your limbs and your trunk, strength levels, past injuries as the brain tries to protect a previously injured area. That's how compensations can happen. So ultimately, there's so many individual differences here, and it's genuinely amazing to see that human beings are so capable of adapting to so many different things. I think that's what makes us very unique. That's why we're so effective as a species in terms of movement economy. All right, so you see a bunch of pictures here, and I'm trying to drive home the point that gait is athletics. Look at Roger Federer right here. Everything you see here is a representation of gait. He is in left stance, and he's exiting right toe off. Roger Federer has incredible gait mechanics. Just watch him play and watch how he moves and controls his center of mass. It's exceptional. Monte Ellis, Steph Curry, ironically used to be on the same team. Monte here is in left stance, right swing. Steph is beginning to plant his left foot on the ground, so he's beginning left loading, and he's exiting right toe off. This guy over here on the speed ladder, you might say, well, he's moving laterally mostly, and he's also on the ball of his feet. Well, it's still a representation of gait. Sprinting, cutting, planting, multi-directional speed, all these things are representations of gait one way or another because they have to do with a similar gait pattern. They all have all these things have very similar qualities in common in terms of how we strike the ground, what muscles should be firing when our foot is on the ground relative to the other foot. As you'll see, all these things have commonalities, and when the foot is on the ground, when you're moving upright in athletics, you are doing some form of gait one way or the other. So now digging into gait a little bit more, I want to preface this by saying I know there's a lot of different ways people talk about gait. There's a lot of different ways to skin this cat, and I know that people think of gait in different ways, shapes, and form, but I just want to make this simple because I understand that a lot of people listening to this presentation might not necessarily have a deep understanding of gait and how it works. So I'm trying to make this very simple as kind of an introductory idea into how gait mechanics work. So just for the purposes of simplicity, I'm just going to keep it pretty simple and break it down into two main phases, stance and swing. And then the two strategies will be loading and propulsion. Loading meaning we're beginning to load our body weight onto that side of the body where we are striking the ground with our foot. We are continually loading more and more weight onto that side of the stance side foot. And then propulsion being we roll onto the forefoot and then we push off, making it propulsion. And then I'm also including swing in here too, just because I'm trying to keep it within two phases, but technically you can think of swing as its own separate entity. But for the purposes of this, again, I think it makes sense to incorporate it within propulsion. So you'll have two kind of sub phases within loading. That's heel strike and mid stance. And then propulsion, you'll have late stance and swing. Also, static stance is technically a phase of gait, and this will matter more down the line, but it's a bilateral symmetrical stance. We haven't really taken a step forward yet. But what's interesting is the central nervous system, when we first begin to take a step forward, or we're about to go into swing on one side, loading on the other, whichever foot is the swing foot, which we have already kind of pre-chosen without even recognizing it, our center of mass is going to shift posteriorly onto that swing foot heel, and then it's going to shift over to the loading heel so we can take a step forward with the swing foot. It helps us to have one foot that we kind of bias into this swing phase, because that makes it a lot easier for us to start the process of gait. And this will matter more a lot later, but I just wanted to cover this right now because you'll see this in the weight room a lot in particular. All right, let's talk loading. So again, the way I'm breaking this down, I'm talking about loading in flexion, internal rotation, adduction, a more posterior pelvic tilt orientation, and also this crazy thing called acetabular femoral internal rotation. Well, basically what that is saying, that AFIR, as I refer to it, and Postural Restoration Institute refers to it, look at the pelvis on the right here. The pelvis on the right is in a loading phase. The pelvis on the left is in a propulsive phase, and we'll get into that later. But let's just focus on the right side of the pelvis here. Here, you're going to have that clockwise rotation. That pelvis is shifting over the femur. It is acetabular femoral internal rotation. The first word is moving on the second word. And because of that, we're getting this internally rotated state where we're able to load our body weight over that stance side foot. And then we're also going to get the joint actions of flexion, internal rotation, and adduction associated with this heel strike, with this mid-stance phase of gait. So when it comes to heel strike, we're going to always have concentric and eccentric activity at all times during all phases of gait. But it's going to differ depending on what phase of gait we're in, so to speak. So concentrically, we're going to have our hamstring posteriorly tilt the pelvis upon heel strike, because that's what's going to initiate the ability of us to load our body weight onto that side. That's what's going to start that process. Our gluteus medius, our gluteus minimus, and our obliques are also working to help pull us over to that side. Glute med, glute min, those are more internal rotator muscles in terms of the fibers we're talking about within them in this heel strike phase of gait. Eccentrically, we're getting this eccentric muscle activity, which is opposing the concentric muscle activity. It's making sure we're not overly posteriorly tilting our pelvis. So our quads are eccentrically slowing us down. Calves are eccentrically slowing us down to make sure we're not over dorsiflexing our foot when we strike the ground. Hip abductors are ensuring, because we're going into that acetabular femoral internal rotation, those are making sure, because they're abductors, we're not excessively going to one side as we load our pelvis over our femur in that heel strike phase. And our erector spinae are firing to make sure that we're not, again, overly posteriorly rotating, but also it's stabilizing us within the frontal plane. So if you see this picture of the foot right here, you'll see that we strike the lateral outside of our heel, and we kind of roll onto the ball of the big toe and eventually the big toe itself when we push off here. So we're going to strike in more dorsiflexion. Then as we progress further, we're going to get into more pronation, and then we're going to resupinate after that. Mid-stance phase of gait, or single leg stance, however you want to refer to it. But essentially, eccentrically, we're going to get more adduction activity. This is completing the process of that AFIR, where the pelvis is shifting over the femur. The adductors are going to be working hard here to stabilize us in the frontal and transverse planes for that internal rotation and adduction activity. The anterior gluteus medius fibers are working here to stabilize the pelvis over the femur as well, and the hamstring is also still posteriorly rotating that pelvis. The obliques are helping the hamstrings with that posterior rotation, and then you still have that eccentric activity of the quads, the calves, and the hip abductors for the same reasons as I proposed on the last slide. But we're starting to begin, as soon as this ends, to shift into more of a propulsive state. Propulsion is then going to be the opposite of loading in terms of joint actions. We're going to get extension, external rotation, abduction, and anterior pelvic tilt orientation, and also acetabular femoral external rotation. So now let's check out the left side of the pelvis here. You'll see that the femur is following the pelvis because the pelvis is the lead and the femur is the follow, just like in a good swing dance. So as that pelvis shifts off of the left femur, that's allowing the femur to swing through so that we can then strike the ground with the heel on the left side. This femur right here is in that propulsive / swing phase of gait right now. Now, let's talk about late stance. Now we're shifting to more of that concentric external rotation, abduction activity. The glute max is going to work, and it should work once we roll onto that big toe. That should be associated with, that big toe should be associated with pushing and propelling us forward. The proximal fibers of the hamstring are going to be working in hip extension. Hip abductors are also working to get that propulsive activity and also resupinate that foot upon toe off. The calves are working for plantar flexion. You have the psoas working to rotate our trunk, and the erector spinae are working for more of that extension moment. And then on the eccentric side of things, it's kind of switched now, as you can tell. The distal fibers of the hamstring are slowing down that knee flexion moment, or sorry, knee extension moment. The distal fibers are more knee flexors, so they're making sure that we're not overly extending our knee and compressing our patella. Adductors are making sure we're not overly abducting, and ankle dorsiflexors are trying to slow down and control that plantar flexion moment. Swing. So concentrically with swing, we're going to have a lot of hip flexor activity. So it is important to have strong hip flexors as long as there's balance within the rest of the kinetic chain. Hip external rotators are also working to help resupinate the foot. Ankle dorsiflexors are starting to kick in so that we can re-dorsiflex, strike the ground with that nice dorsiflexed ankle and calcaneus. Eccentrically, we're going to have hamstring activity, we're going to have adductors, and we're going to have calves. This is very similar to, for sprinting, for example, we don't want to overstride. We don't want to strike the ground too far in front of us, because if we did, then that would put the hamstrings and calves under a potentially too much of an eccentric load. It would be an awkward ground contact, and then that's when you see hamstring strains or repetitive hamstring stress. So those hamstrings need to fire eccentrically to make sure that we can strike the ground in a good, healthy manner near or under our center of mass in gait when we strike the ground in heel strike. Since the whole idea of this presentation is weight room training, is gait training, whether you're aware of it or not, let's see some examples of how that can be applied in real life. So here you might see a rear foot elevated split squat, but what I see is left loading and right swing, because that right leg is back in the air, so to speak, and the left pelvis is in that loading phase, because I would hope he's feeling a little bit of his heel on the ground. I would hope that he was feeling his adductors, his obliques, and his hamstring working here. If he doesn't, well, we can talk about strategies and how you can position yourself to get the outcome musculature you want working. So here, this is just, a glute bridge, a nice looking glute bridge, but what I see is right propulsion and left swing. If I were training this guy, I would probably have his foot a little bit further up here, but for the purposes of the demonstration, I think this does a great job of illustrating that, yes, he is in toe off here. He's training his glute concentrically, his proximal hamstring fibers and hip extension, and he's also working that left hip flexor for exactly that right propulsion and left swing. So whether he's aware of what he's doing or not, this is the phase of gait he's putting himself in. Okay, left loading and right swing. This is pretty straightforward, I feel like, based on the other two examples. I would hope he's feeling his heel there. I would hope he's feeling his hamstring as that knee translates forward. And I would hope he's feeling his abs on that side too. The right leg is not on the ground. It is certainly in that swing phase of motion, that swing phase of gait, and then ultimately this is going to help reinforce good loading mechanics if he's doing this exercise correctly and reinforcing the right muscles working at the right time relative to where his foot is on the ground or on the box. So now, what do you see here? I see static stance. Does this look like gait to you? I don't know, just some food for thought. So I'm trying to get your brain churning here in terms of bilateral activities. How much does this really carry over to gait? I'll leave that up to you. And then finally, right here, we have a Copenhagen plank. But hang on a second. We have left adductor working with right obliques concentrically. That doesn't necessarily add up. To me, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense because why would I want to be working the right obliques with the left adductor? When I'm in single leg stance, when I'm in mid stance phase of gait, I want my left adductor working with my left obliques if my left foot is on the ground. I wouldn't want to train this pattern because that goes directly against what proper human movement should be looking like and what musculature should be working in single leg stance phase of gait. So I'm not saying we should never do this exercise. I'm just trying to illustrate the fact that I think we need to look at these things in a little bit different of a lens to understand what muscles do we want working at what time and how does this relate to the pattern of upright movement we're integrating within this person. Okay, so in my opinion, I would be doing you guys a disservice if I didn't talk about human asymmetry and why it matters, because this is going to directly correlate to gait in many ways, as you guys will see soon. And if you want to learn more about this idea, take a course from Postural Restoration Institute. They go into a lot more detail about asymmetry than I will right now, but I'm going to cover the basics just so we're on the same page. So the left side of the brain, which controls the right side of the body, has more cortical motor neurons, meaning that there is a higher degree of an ability to sense things on the right side of our body. Our right diaphragm has more leverage to act as a postural stabilizer. So look at the diaphragm here on the bottom left picture. You'll see that the right crura have two attachments as opposed to one on the left, and they're thicker, significantly thicker, and they attach lower. So because of this asymmetrical design of the diaphragm, we have more leverage to have that right diaphragm act as a postural stabilizer when we have too much asymmetry going on. When we can't recruit the right diaphragm correctly for inhalation, that diaphragm loves to take over as a stabilizer of the anterior spine. And that left diaphragm tends to be in more of a respiration role, more of an inhalation role, for the reasons you'll see on the upcoming couple of slides. And we also have more organs on the right side of our body. So if I were to cut myself down the middle vertically in half, then I put my right side on a scale, I would weigh just a little bit more on my right side than I do my left, because I have my colon, I have my pancreas, I have my liver packed on this right side. So these things matter because ultimately we are going to be biased into the right hip. Most human beings, I would say pretty much everyone, unless you have your heart on the other side of your body and your organs are flipped, which is very rare but still does occur, you're going to be biased into this right side pattern. You're going to be biased with your pelvis oriented to the right, and then in order to straighten ourselves out so that we don't walk in a circle to the right, we kind of rotate our trunk to the left. Now this allows us to find stability and as much symmetry as we can, given this kind of asymmetrical makeup of the human body. So if you look at the gentleman on the right here, he is displaying exactly that. But a common compensation that happens out of this is that we can go bilaterally extended. So because the left pelvis is forward and the right pelvis is back, many people can compensate into a bilaterally extended pelvic posture, pelvic orientation. And that would be the people you see with big low back arches, poor rib cage mobility, generally poor movers, and they love external rotation, abduction. They're stuck in propulsive phases of gait. I'm sure this picture looks very familiar to you because it was on one of the first couple of slides. Now, let's take this asymmetrical lens we just acquired and apply it to this picture right here. So, ironically enough, his left foot is going to be in more swing and his right foot is going to be in more loading here as he begins the gait cycle. So, if we are biased with this left half of our pelvis into more of a propulsive state and the right half of our pelvis into more of a loading state, then it benefits us to be able to start the gait cycle unconsciously with one side of our body. Look at NFL wide receivers. Look at MMA fighters. Look at sprinters. They love to start in their static stance before their staggered static stance before they start running or start a punch or a kick. They love to have their left leg ahead of their right leg, and that's because this natural asymmetrical nature of our body sets us up to be biased in that orientation. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's only a bad thing or a problem if this asymmetry becomes unmanaged, but it ultimately is beneficial for us to be able to start this gait process without having to really think about it, without having to decide which leg am I going to push off of, which leg is going to be my swing and loading foot. We already know because our asymmetrical nature sets us there. So as I mentioned, we are going to have this right pelvis be in a bias of loading and internal rotation. The left pelvis is going to be in this bias of propulsion and external rotation. And if you compensate out of that into full-on anterior pelvic tilt, you're going to have a bilateral propulsion bias because your weight is going to be more forward on your forefoot, and you're probably going to struggle to find your heels. And by no means are these the only things that happen. These are just by far the most common things you're going to see because we're all human beings. We're different for sure, but we're not that different. We still have the same principal makeup. Most of us still have all four limbs, and we still have trunks and organs that are packed in the same way. So ultimately, when it comes to working with human beings, this is an important thing to understand because this is the bias you will tend to see over and over again. That's why people love to jump off of their left foot more than their right foot if they're going to do a single leg plyometric. That's why a lot of people are right-handed. That's why a lot of people like to shift into their right hip in the sticking point of a squat. You'll see this time and time again. So I can't just say these things and not show you some evidence, right? So here are 3 force plate measurements that I've taken of 2 athletes and 1 older gentleman on the right here. But I've measured literally hundreds of athletes, hundreds and hundreds of athletes on a force plate before. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that at least 98% of people present in this pattern. And I hate to put a number on it, but I'm just trying to show you and illustrate the point that this is, guys, this really is just about everyone. Look at this volleyball player on the left here. I told her to get in a nice neutral stance, and I want you to do this overhead squat and show me what you got. Her neutral stance, or at least her perception of a neutral stance, was her left foot ahead of her right foot. You can see how that's happening there. And she's classic in this right side dominant pattern, this right loading bias, because look at how much more weight is on her right heel, and look at how much more weight is on her left forefoot. And then she still has, I don't know if you guys can see that, it's a little blurry, but 61% of her weight on her right foot. Now, we have a track athlete in the middle here. Now, she's not even in a quarter squat. She is in like an 8th squat. And she still has 67% of her weight on her right heel. Look at how much that heat map is lighting up underneath that right heel. So even when you're standing, even when you're going into a squat at the very beginning with not a crazy heavy load, she's still biasing her right side. And then this gentleman on the right here, he's in his 60s. He's definitely older, and you can probably tell because he's very stiff. His toes are pointed out. He has no weight on his heels for the most part, but he's still biasing his right side. He has 60% of his weight on his right side there. So even though he's compensated out of it into this bilaterally propulsion biased state where he's on his toes all the time, it doesn't mean he's still not favoring his right side a little bit. So now let's talk about something I feel is very important. So we love to talk about unilateral versus bilateral in this industry, and I think that bilateral exercises are incredible. I love them. I'd be very sad if I couldn't do them anymore for both myself and my athletes and my clients. But ultimately, if you look at things from that evolutionary perspective, we are naturally alternating and reciprocating human beings. Alternating meaning one leg comes forward, the other arm comes forward, and then vice versa. Reciprocating meaning being able to go through proper flexion and extension through our pelvis, our rib cage, and our joints. So when we're doing bilateral exercises, it just promotes a lot of stiffness. It's not very representative of the gait cycle other than static stance, but how many of us have athletes that are constantly in static stance? I can't think of too many. If you're an upright athlete, this stuff matters so much because bilateral exercises aren't going to reinforce a good efficient gait pattern if we're doing so many of them. That's why I'm a fan of unilateral exercises in terms of priorities, so to speak. I would never get rid of bilateral exercises. There's way too many good things to be gained from them. But I think that a lot of people, a lot of coaches, unfortunately don't consider this lens too much and don't consider the fact that so much of our lives is single leg dominant. So much of our lives when we were hunters and gatherers was single leg dominant. When we went to pick up something off of the ground back in the day, do you think we thought of, okay, keep my core tight, feel my heels, and drive through the ground? But probably not. We were probably in awkward staggered stances, split stances, and we were picking up things in awkward positions, but our body is very resilient. And I think that ultimately we weren't meant to do heavy bilateral exercises all the time. I think in terms of how we've lived our lives, our history as a species, we really have just been on one leg a lot of the time. And just without even considering that, gait is a highly single leg dominant activity. If you guys are familiar with reflexive performance reset, or RPR for short, they even argue this, that the brain shows less activity when it's a bilateral exercise compared to a unilateral exercise. The brain likes the unilateral exercise more. It's more familiar. It's able to feel more stable, so to speak, in this unilateral pattern as opposed to a bilateral pattern, which is, for lack of a better term, perhaps a little bit more foreign to the body. So in terms of programming for athletes, clients, or anyone, you want to see where they're at, what their biases are, and then you want to give them what they don't have. So if we have more loading on the right, I want to give them more propulsion on the right. If they have more propulsion on the left, I want to give them more loading on the left. I want to reinforce good mechanics so that ultimately we can naturally alternate and reciprocate, and we can have the variability, the systemic variability, the joint variability, the respiratory capability. Now, here I'm going to show you guys the same exercise, but it's going to be executed two different ways so that you can see how you can bias a certain exercise, the same exercise, frankly, to get a different outcome relative to loading and propulsion. So here I am up against a wall, and I'm going to shift my pelvis over my femur. My left pelvis is being shifted. I'm pushing my right pelvis forward, closing it off, and I'm going into that acetabular femoral internal rotation. You can do the inverse with the same exact exercise. I'm going to push my pelvis off of my femur, go into more propulsion. Here I'm going to be feeling a lot more glute max and abductors, whereas before I was feeling internal rotators, adductors, and also my hamstring. This is way more propulsive musculature. Okay, now we're going to hit a very important topic. I think this is one of the most important slides in this whole presentation. And that's because there's a certain way a lot of people think about getting muscles to reorient the body into better posture, better movement. And let's take for a really easy example, let's take someone who's bilaterally extended, big anterior pelvic tilt, propulsion bias on both sides. We could take this person and say, well, because you have this big anterior pelvic tilt, your hamstrings are on this eccentric orientation, and we need to give you more loading, more concentric hamstring activity. So we're going to give you prone hamstring curls on a machine, and we're going to put you there and go to town. Go until they burn, and then hopefully that will make a change within your pelvis and bring your pelvis back, which will then allow your brain to hopefully adopt that posture if we do this enough times. But in my opinion, I think it works the exact opposite of that. I think we need to respect the fact that the brain has selected this strategy. If you remember the self-organization slide, our brain is self-organized into a certain posture, movement pattern, or muscular orientation because that's what it feels like it needs to do for proper stability, to maximize your current movement economy based on the movement options and limitations placed upon your system. And then because of that, the brain is going to position the skeleton in a certain way to achieve that, But the skeletal position is going to drive muscular function. If your pelvis is forward, you're in that bilateral extension, then your hamstrings are going to assume an orientation of being too eccentrically elongated. Your quadriceps are going to be in more of a concentric state. And then you're going to have your abdominals be in more of an eccentric state too. So you can see how it's the skeletal position which is ultimately driving this muscular orientation and function capabilities. And then we also need to respect neurological references as they relate to the phase of gait we're talking about. What does that mean? Well, let's take that same person who is bilaterally extended, and then let's think about a different way we might be able to reinforce better loading mechanics that actually relates to gait more. We could take this person and then put them in a position where they're feeling their heels against something firm, and they're posteriorly tilting their pelvis to get that loading pelvic phase, that loading pelvic orientation. And then you would feel concentric hamstring activity because we would be pushing into this object and then recruiting our hamstrings in some effective manner. And then we would also be breathing through it. Breathing is so important because if you can't breathe through a position, you don't own it. So if you're tense, if you're anxious, and you're trying to position your skeleton in a manner that's going to reorient your muscular activity, and you're tense, you're shallowly breathing, you're hyperventilating, then you're going to activate the sympathetic branch of your autonomic nervous system. That's going to be that fight or flight stage. That's going to be more associated with your brain sensing a threat. Or we could slow it down. We can control our breath. We can fully exhale. We can pause after the exhale to heighten sensory awareness. And then we can inhale through our nose, which nasal inhalations are so important for proper sympathetic regulation and sympathetic drive within the nervous system. This is going to allow the brain to let go so that we can ultimately make changes in the long term, as opposed to just locking up our system more, because the brain doesn't want to adapt something, a new posture or movement strategy that it thinks is a threat. We've got to find a way around that. We've got to allow the brain to let go and actually adopt these changes. So when we train loading, we want to train that acetabular femoral internal rotation if possible. Sometimes it's not, that's okay, but if I can get it, mostly on single leg exercises, then I'm certainly going to go after it. Heel midfoot reference, because think when you strike the ground in gait, you're striking on your heel, you roll onto the midfoot for mid stance, and then that's basically where you are, so that's where you want to associate your weight when you're training loading in the weight room. Goal muscle integration, hamstrings, adductors, obliques, anterior gluteus medius. What is this? This is all the joint actions, the muscles that are going to get the joint actions associated with loading. That flexion, that adduction, that internal rotation is all going to be accomplished primarily through these muscles. There are certainly other muscles that affect this, but for the most part, these are the ones we should be primarily worried about. Now, when we have a beginner, I wouldn't integrate all of these things at once. I would probably go after one or two in a very basic position. And then we also want to consider integrating more muscles as we get further along within their program. So maybe at first I go after just hamstrings or just adductors, or maybe hamstrings and obliques. And you'll see more examples of this in the next couple of slides. But generally speaking, if you have someone that's brand new, get them competent with a couple of muscles and then start to integrate more in more difficult positions as you progress. We also want to think about the increased need on the left side, because remember, the left side is in this propulsive state. We might want to consider an asymmetrical approach to our training because we have an asymmetrical body. So now for some examples. You guys remember what I was talking about earlier with the prone hamstring curl individual? Well, this is a perfect example of exactly what I described we could do instead. Give them references as it relates to gait. Give them a posterior pelvic tilt. Give them good breathing through this position, and also associate good skeletal position with muscular function. You can do all of these things with such a simple exercise like this right here. Now, notice how my heels are firmly on that foam roller. That's going to create a neurological association between the heels and all of these other things working, especially since I'm breathing nice and controlled through it. I'm reaching to get more oblique activity. As I exhale, I'm feeling my abs and I'm digging in to feel that concentric hamstring activity. And then I'm making this association because I'm staying relaxed through this. In terms of this exercise right here, this is a fantastic way to start integrating those single leg stance muscles, those mid stance phase of gait muscles in an upright position. So that foam roller right there is serving as a reference for me to push my knee in. That's going to help me get my pelvis over my femur in AFIR. That's going to allow me to feel my adductor, my anterior glute med, my oblique, and my hamstring all on this side. This is a very effective tool to train this good loading pattern. And notice how I'm going nice and slow. I'm controlling it. I'm really focused on sensing the right things here. I'm not concerned about load. I'm concerned about integrating things, sensing them, and making sure my positioning is very optimal.
All right, so that plate is
Here,
on the ground
this is
as
going to
a
look a lot
reference
more
to our
like Gait.
brain,
This is
because
more of an
if that
advanced
front foot
level
is elevated, then
exercise,
that's
for
going to
lack of a
give our
better term,
brains
but this
a
is a
heightened
really
sensory awareness
good
of how to
way
hike
to
up that
integrate
hip that's
single leg
working there. I'm
stance
feeling those
muscles,
single leg
loading
stance
muscles,
muscles. I'm going
through
nice and
a full
slow,
range
and
of
I'm seeing
motion while
how
we're
long I
training
can
swing
go
on the other
before I start
side.
to
So
compensate.
that
This is a
plate
really good
underneath my
activity
heel
for getting
there,
people to
underneath
feel
my
these muscles
foot,
work over a
is
long period
serving
of
as a
time.
reference
Great
for me
exercise
to
for
bring the
runners,
floor
great
up.
exercise
Because
for
I'm
people that are
shifting
on their
into my
feet all
left
day,
side,
or really
it's
just about
pretty
anyone who
amazing how
needs
much
these
easier
muscles to
that gets
work
when I
for an
put
extended
something
period of time.
underneath that foot, because that allows me to bring the floor up, allows me to shift better as I
All right,
hike that
so
left
that
hip
plate is on
up.
the ground
I'm
as
feeling
a
my
reference
adductor,
to
my
our
glute
brain,
med, my
because if
hamstring, my
that front foot
obliques
is
on this left
elevated, then
side.
that's going to
And
give
this
our
looks just
brains
like Gait. I'm making
a
sure I
heightened sensory
integrate all
awareness of
those
how to
muscles
hike up
together. I
that hip
love
that's
to
working
give
there.
this
I'm
to
feeling those
runners
single
because
leg
I tell
stance
them, look,
muscles. I'm
if
going
you
nice
can't
and
do this for
slow,
like
and I'm seeing
2 minutes and
how
feel those
long I can
muscles
go
working
before
together,
I start
how
to
do you expect to be
compensate.
able to
This is a
shift into
really
your
good
left hip,
activity
which
for
is
getting
in
people to
this
feel these
propulsive
muscles work over a
bias,
long
for
period of
more
time.
than,
Great
a
exercise for
mile? How are you
runners,
expecting to do it
great
for five
exercise for
miles
people
if you
that are on
can't do
their
it for
feet all
two
day,
minutes
or
here,
really just about
feeling those
anyone who
muscles
needs
work
these
together?
muscles to
So
work for an
I
extended
love to
period of
use these
time.
exercises to reinforce proper patterns as we do them over a period of time.
All right, so that play.
So when it comes to training propulsion now, again, it's the inverse of loading. So we're getting acetabular femoral external rotation, if we can get it, medial arch big toe reference. So just because we're feeling our medial arch and big toe doesn't mean we still don't have our full foot flat on the ground. We still want to do that to maintain proper stability, especially through a weighted exercise. But where I'm pushing on the concentric activity in particular is going to be on that big toe, the ball of the big toe, and also feeling that arch work together, because we need to roll onto our big toe from this lateral position onto more of this pronated state where we can push off and then effectively get that good glute max and abduction activity. So those are the muscles we want to integrate. We want those external rotators. We want those hip abductors, and we want that glute max working. We want to associate that with that big toe in terms of what we're feeling on the ground. And then consider the increasing it on the right side. Again, an asymmetrical body requires an asymmetrical approach. So for this first example exercise right here, this is a static exercise. And there's something I want to point out before I start the video. It's the fact that I need to keep my big toe on the ground, but I also need to heavily recruit my glute max and abductors. In this sort of activity, you see it in the weight room a lot, and like a lateral lunge, for example. You'll see people push their hips back, but they'll keep their knee in line with their toe. Well, I don't think that's highly effective at recruiting the glute max to its maximum capacity, because your glute max is an external rotator. So wouldn't it make sense to position our pelvis in a way that could sufficiently recruit the glute max and the abductors? So what I'm doing is I'm going to push my knee out. I'm going to abduct it, but look at how I'm not overly supinating that right foot. I'm keeping ground contact with my big toe. This is going to allow me to get that more externally rotated pelvic orientation. This is going to allow me to create that neurological association between my big toe, my glute max, and my hip abductors. Now, this is now just a dynamic version of what we just did. We're just taking this into a true traditional lateral lunge pattern. But look at how I'm still pushing my knee out. This is harder because you're having to start from that static stance and going into it. It's no longer stationary. Pushing my knee out, feeling the big toe, not focused on load, focused on integrating the right things with high sensory awareness. So this is a little bit more tricky than the last ones because here we're integrating a lot more things, a lot more positions together. I'm hiking up my left knee here and pushing into that wall to bring my obliques together on the left side. I'm going to be getting a lot of left oblique activity. And then we're also pushing out that right knee. This is more of a squat pattern. I'm kind of dropping down here, but also I'm not coming too far forward onto my forefoot on the right because that would compress my patella and my knee quite a bit. That wouldn't feel too good. So I'm really focusing on feeling glute max and hip abductors here. Still focusing on creating that neurological association between my big toe, medial arch, and also those same exact muscles we're targeting. Now, if we want to train swing, and I made this its own thing for a reason, it works different muscles a little bit differently than propulsion does. So I think this is worth spending some time on. We want toe off on the contralateral side, whatever foot we're not working, and we want dorsiflexion on the swing leg because remember, we're dorsiflexing to resupinate the foot so that it can strike the ground again, and we're kind of exiting propulsion on the other side while we are dorsiflexing that actual leg and hip flexor we're going to be working. So we want goal muscle integration of hip flexors on the swing leg and glute max and hip abductors on the stance leg. We want to, again, consider the increased need on the right side here and consider avoiding this at first in individuals that are highly patterned, highly extended, people that are really buried in their right hip. I wouldn't particularly do this on their left hip because they probably already have a lot of good concentric hip flexor activity. So I would be really concerned about doing this with people who are ready for it and they have good muscle balance throughout their entire kinetic chain. Example exercise number 1 here. This looks like a wall drill. If you guys ever work with sprinters, you ever do basic running mechanic drills, then you will see this position quite a bit. I am pushing into that wall, feeling abs, and I'm trying to keep a neutral spine, but ultimately look at how I'm in toe off on the right side or the stance leg. Sorry, that's my left side there. And then I'm alternating here, feeling the hip flexor, feeling the glute in the back leg, feeling that glute work hard as I'm going through that propulsion, and then dorsiflexing that foot I'm bringing up for hip flexor. So this exercise right here looks very similar, and it really is, but it's harder actually because since we're on all fours, usually that makes things easier, but for the purposes of this makes it actually hard because I'm having to fight gravity. I'm having to maintain really good position while I feel these hip flexors fire, while I still feel my big toe on that back wall, and while I dorsiflex that leg that I'm bringing through for good hip flexor activity. Now, let's talk integration. So what I mean by integration is that we are now beginning to incorporate things going on both sides of the body more because whatever is happening on one side of the body in gait, generally speaking, the opposite is happening on the other. So when we're in toe off on one side, we're in swing in the other. When we're in loading on one phase, we tend to be in propulsion on the other. So this first exercise is a split squat, but I'm shifted into my front hip here. I'm pushing in that back wall with my big toe, with my medial arch to get glute to help push me further over to my left hip. So I'm in AFIR on the left, AFER on the right here. Example exercise number 2 here. This is giving people the exact opposite of what a lot of them already have, which is that right loading, left propulsion. Well, look at what I'm doing here. I'm pushing that right knee down so I can shift into left AFIR, reaching that left arm down for obliques, and I'm reaching that right arm back to emulate the stance phase of gait on the left side. This is a great activity for higher levels of integration. That band is there for more glute max and hip abductor activity. And I'm feeling a ton of hamstring, inner thigh, adductor, outside hip, glute med all day on this one. And I'm breathing to control it. Example exercise number 3 here. We have, oh, wait a second. This doesn't really look like gait, but that's okay because even though it doesn't look exactly like gait, it still doesn't mean we're not training these patterns. I'm pushing my top leg ahead of my bottom leg here. I'm getting that hip abductor activity on the top side leg. Notice how my top foot is a little bit ahead of my bottom foot there. I'm also lifting up. That towel roll is underneath my left waist for left abs, so I can't collapse down and cheat with my right ab wall. And also tons of adductor on that activity as well. Take home points. So overall, guys, I just wanted to make it very clear that unilateral training is representative of gait if you make it or not. It's going to reinforce patterns. We want to understand what muscles we want working at a certain given time in gait, and we want to reinforce those. We want to drive those home. We don't want to be constantly working propulsion on both sides of the body at the same time, or loading on both sides of the body at the same time. There's nothing wrong with bilateral exercises, like I said, but we've got to think about how unilateral can be a little bit more specific to a lot of the adaptations and movement quality we're going after in athletes and just general clients. We want to respect the brain and skeletal position. The brain has selected this strategy for us to be in. If there's no pain or movement efficiency problems, then hey, let's not worry about it. But if there are, the brain has put us there for a very specific reason, and the skeletal position is indicative of that strategy the brain has selected, and then the muscular orientation will therefore reflect that. We want to integrate opposing phases of gait in training when we can. Again, this goes along with more unilateral stuff. We want to make sure there's propulsion going on one side, loading going on the other, toe off on one side, swing on the other, etc. And then ultimately, if you can't breathe through these exercises, you won't be able to own them. It'll be so much harder to get the adaptations you're looking for, to change movement quality, to unconsciously alter movement efficiency and gait patterns if we can't allow the brain to adopt this and then allow these things to happen when we're not thinking about it. I have a really cool announcement to make, and I have to start it off by saying I have a coaches club, and this is essentially just a community-based thing for different coaches and really anyone who's interested in fitness to come together, talk about different things, talk shop, but ultimately there are courses within this club where I have a new topic every month, and I build upon previous courses content, and we're building towards something pretty cool in this club. I have different lessons every single week released based off of that topic. I cite my sources, I have notes, and I have videos that explain everything in great detail. So, the courses we have going on right now, we have this business course. We also have a limb art model course, recognizing someone's respiration strategy and then giving them what they don't have to powerfully restore range of motion, powerfully restore performance, speed, strength, all these incredible things. We also have events every single week. We have a webinar at least once or twice a month, if not more. We have business chats. Every single week we have a video chat where we get together, talk shop on a new subject. Ultimately, it is just community driven. So we've had pelvic floor PTs. We've had people talk about RPR, different systems like total motion release. And tomorrow we have Jack Anderson coming on to talk about isometrics for health and performance. But just for $15 a month. This is the last weekend it's ever going to be $15 a month, and then it's going back up to $20 starting on the 13th. Today's Saturday, it's going on Monday, $20, so get in now while you can. The value is just incredible. There's already 4 full courses available for you guys, and it is just a ridiculous deal. So get it $15 before it goes to $20. And then I also offer coaching consultations. If this material interests you, if you want to learn more about this stuff, I offer one-on-one coaching consultation programs. It's month by month. We have a weekly video call with slides very similar to this. And then we will just progress through all these different concepts and then build upon it and make it very specific to what you as an individual want to get out of the program. And then there's different programs offered, there's exercises, and we go into a good amount of detail so that you feel comfortable with these what can be seemingly complex ideas, but we make it simple, we make it fun, and we make it effective. Thank you guys for listening. If you are interested in learning more, my website is there below. You can find me on social media there, and I appreciate you guys taking the time to listen to me talk.